Good evening. Please welcome to the stage Elise Levine, Executive Director, AERA.
Well, good evening, good day, good morning. Welcome everyone to this important convening, wherever your location and whatever your time zone. I am Elise Levine, and I am honored to be AERA's Executive Director. On behalf of AERA, we are especially honored to be at Howard University today. I am literally moved I'm especially moved to be here. I had the really privilege of spending part of this morning with 8 of the HBCU deans in the United States, and that was just a terrific meeting, and it was just such a wonderful prelude to welcoming all of you who are in person at Howard University's Crampton Auditorium in Washington, D.C. I also want to welcome all of those who are joining us virtually from across the country. We know there's Brown watch parties going on and around the world. This is just a special event as the 21st annual Brown Lecture in Education Research, the first being on the 50th anniversary in 2004. I wish to acknowledge that tonight's event in Washington, D.C. is being held on the ancestral territory of Indigenous peoples. On Piscataway land, I ask that we take a few moments in recognizing the Indigenous peoples on whose land we stand. The American Educational Research Association stands committed to the critical importance of education and to the role of research and evidence in addressing issues of equity and making education a powerful and effective positive force in the lives of individuals from all backgrounds, cultures, and societies. And it is so instrumental to the future of our democracies. This commitment is central to why we are here today and what we will learn and discuss together in this lecture. This year is not only the 21st Brown Lecture, but it is also the 70th anniversary of the Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court decision. Well, we traditionally hold this lecture not in May, but in October. So we know there have been other kinds of important events during the year. This is a special anniversary tonight. We are thrilled, really thrilled, to have the Brown Lecture at Howard University. Howard University is not only one of the top HBCUs in this country, but the scholarship that took place here and the significant role of the Howard School of Law and, in particular, Dean Charles Hamilton Houston, were central to shaping the legal strategy and the education of lawyers who led the fight in multiple cases, including the cases that led to the Brown v. Board of Education decision. We are experiencing a complex time as a nation, with an erosion of the nation's commitment to equity and justice in education being seen in the most recent Supreme Court decision rendered last year, and in the action of state leaders and local school boards around our country. These issues will be central to tonight's lecture. I want to acknowledge the generous support of the 22 supporters and friends of the Brown Lecture. Without them, tonight's event would not have been possible. The visualization, because of the number of supporters and friends. I will not read all of their names, but they are listed on the screen and are acknowledged both in the program and on the AERA website. Thank you to our supporters and friends. Having friends collaborate with us. More than the contribution, but the network of support is extraordinarily important to what we stand for as an education research community and as a research association. I would like also to thank the Brown Lecture Selection Committee, chaired by Dr. James D. Anderson, who also chairs the AERA Social Justice Action Committee, an education historian par excellence and a former Brown lecturer, for the efforts that the committee put in this year to selecting the Brown lecturer for the 21st year. The hard work and insights of this group of scholars are deeply appreciated, and as you will see, well worthwhile in its outcome and choice. Now, I would like to welcome and officially thank Dr. Dawn Williams, Dean of the Howard University School of Education. We are at AERA privileged that she made it happen. You know, it was a little phone call, and I think I caught her on her cell phone, and I said, you might want to schedule a longer call. And she said, what would you like? And I said, well, our executive board would really like the Brown Lecture to be at Howard University. And it's one yes, and here we are today with a myriad of details that you managed for us so effectively. So it's with deep appreciation and affection that I bring you Dean Dawn Williams.
It was quite the easy ask. Well, good evening. It is my honor to welcome you to Howard University for the 21st Annual Brown Lecture, while also commemorating the 70th anniversary of the Brown decision. It was within these walls that legal precedents were studied, arguments were developed, and litigation was rehearsed. Brown is often not taught to the fullness of its story and legacy. I commend AERA under the leadership of Dr. Elise Levine for hosting this annual lecture that allows us to expand our knowledge and perspective on a Supreme Court decision that relied heavily on legal and social science research. It is an exceptional example of how research can shape public policy. The scholars, activists, and social engineers understood that the purpose of social sciences is not only to understand the world, but also to change the world. And that is extremely inspirational. Howard University has made its mark known on social justice. For over 150 years, this institution has been at the forefront of producing scholars and activists who have shaped the course of history in America and beyond. These halls have echoed with voices of trailblazers like Thurgood Marshall, who as a student and later as a lawyer laid the groundwork for the Hallmark Brown decision. Marshall's commitment to civil rights was forged right here, demonstrating how education can empower individuals to challenge social injustice and systemic injustice. We cannot forget the vital contributions of alumnus Kenneth Clark and his wife, Mamie Clark, whose groundbreaking research unveiled the psychological scars of segregation. Their work illuminated the detrimental effects of racism on young minds, providing crucial evidence that would help to dismantle the oppressive structures of Jim Crow. Through their research, they transformed our understanding of identity and self-worth in the face of discrimination. Howard has also been a nurturing ground for countless other scholars and activists. Charles Hamilton Houston, Charles Thompson, James Nabritt, Oliver Hill, Vice President Kamala Harris. From these voices of the Black Power movement to the architects of modern social justice, this university has produced leaders who have taken their fight for equity beyond the classroom, advocating for change on local, national, and global stages. This institution stands not just as a place of learning, but as a powerful catalyst for change. It reminds us that education is not merely about acquiring knowledge, but about using that knowledge to uplift communities, challenge injustices, and forge a brighter future for us all. I started my day in dialogue with other HBCU education deans who are with us here today about ways to advance the work towards this end. It is quite uplifting now to conclude my day with this community of scholars to learn more from Professor Elise Boddie. Please consider yourself welcomed.
Thank you, Dawn. I would now, it's my pleasure to introduce AERA President Janelle Scott, who is not only a highly respected and accomplished scholar in her own right, but a dear friend, mentor, and valued colleague to so many of us in education policy and the education research field. Dr. Scott is professor at the University of California, Berkeley, in the School of Education and African American Studies. She holds the Robert J. and Mary Catherine Bergenow Distinguished Chair in Educational Disparities and is the chair of the Race, Diversity, and Education Policy Cluster of the Otherings and Belonging Institute, as well as Associate Dean for Students in the College of Letters and Science. Obviously, her day is busy. Janelle, I am so pleased to be able to share this year with you and to turn the introductions over to you tonight.
Good evening. All right. Thank you, Elise, and thank you to everyone joining us this evening for the 21st Annual Brown Lecture, including those attending in person, as well as the thousands more across the country and around the world joining us on the live stream. For more than 2 decades, the AERA Brown Lecture has illuminated the important role of research in advancing understanding of equality and equity in education. The lectureship was inaugurated in 2004 to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Brown versus Board education decision, in which the U.S. Supreme Court took scientific research into account. As we commemorate the 70th anniversary of this landmark decision, which paved the way for critical civil rights legislation that expanded educational and social opportunity, we recognize that the legal winds have shifted. Despite the decades of education research showing the importance of racial diversity and equitable pedagogy, practices, and policies, the legal foundation that the Brown decision was built upon has become fractured. As we take stock of the ongoing significance and promise of the Brown decision, we recognize the continued need for education researchers, educators, lawyers, policymakers, and advocates to work together to complete the ongoing work of ensuring that this country lives up to its democratic ideals. The Brown Lecture is a powerful annual reminder of the central role that research can play in advancing equality in education across racial and ethnic groups, countries of origin, socioeconomic status, language, gender and sexual identity, and other areas that diversify our society. It is wonderful to be at Howard University, where the intellectual, legal, and strategic architecture undergirding the civil rights movement was built in collaboration with Black educators and advocates. I join Felice Levine in expressing our gratitude to Dean Williams and the Howard University community for hosting AERA. Each year, we select as our speaker a preeminent scholar whose work has contributed substantially to the fight for justice and equity in education. During a challenging time for our country, when public education is under assault and the democratic ideals of equality, opportunity, and justice are being threatened, we are fortunate for the work and insight of our 2024 Brown Lecture speaker, Professor Elise Boddie. Professor Boddie is the James B. Campbell Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School, a prominent scholar and champion of dismantling systemic racism. She bridges diverse disciplines and practices of scholarship, teaching, community, and service. Prior to joining the law faculty at the University of Michigan, Professor Boddie taught at Rutgers Law School, where she founded and directed the Inclusion Project. In that capacity, she worked with students, faith leaders, educators, the legal community, and researchers in a multi-sector initiative to encourage the creation of equitable education systems in New Jersey public schools. In 2021, President Biden appointed her to the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States. Professor Boddie also served as the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Civil Rights Division of the U.S. Department of Justice. She is an elected member of the American Law Institute and is also an American Bar Foundation Fellow. Professor Boddie previously was the Director of Litigation for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund and has served in leadership positions on the boards of the American Constitution Society and the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. Her work is widely cited and discussed in academic and non-academic circles. Her commentary has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Salon, Slate, and the Huffington Post, among other news outlets. She has appeared in national and international news programs, including a BBC documentary, The Black American Fight for Freedom. We are honored for the opportunity to learn from Professor Boddie's knowledge and wisdom as she explores the role of Brown as a guide for democracy in a time of peril. Please join me in welcoming oh my gosh, I'm so flustered that she's about to come out. The 2024 Brown Lecture and Education Research Speaker, Elise Boddie.
Wow. Hello, everyone. Oh, you answered back. I love that. Thank you. It is such a pleasure, a joy, and honor to be here with you tonight. And I want to thank the committee, President Felice Levine, of course, Janelle Scott, and Dean Don Williams for all of their support and for bringing me here tonight, as well as the committee, especially the committee, I guess I should say. It is delightful to be here at Howard University to celebrate the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. This is where it all happened. And so I feel a special energy in the room tonight. I should also say that my grandmother and grandfather met at Howard University. So, yeah. So I guess if it wasn't for Howard, I would not be here. So thank you all. I was saying to folks backstage, I stood on this stage 20 years ago for an event celebrating Brown versus Board of Education. And so it just feels like, in many ways, I'm coming full circle. So the title of my talk, if you could cue the slide, is Brown and the Democratic Ideals of Equality, Justice, and Freedom. In their book, How to Save a Constitutional Democracy, Tom Ginsburg and Aziz Hook identify 3 floor requirements for a working democracy. They start, of course, with free and fair elections, but also extend to liberal rights of speech and association that are necessary for the democratic process to survive. It is no secret that these are critical times for public education. We are living in a time of social division where communities fear difference and where distrust is high and communities are pitted against educators and against each other. Schools are struggling with book bans and culture wars and schemes to dismantle and privatize public education. And we have a short clip.
Threats educators are facing.
Don't put masks on our kids anymore, because I'm telling you what, I'm a mom who's fearless, and I will come after you.
You're allowing child abuse. You're allowing child abuse. You're allowing child abuse. You're allowing child abuse.
So that gives us a sense of what educators are dealing with, people who serve honorably on school boards, people who are teaching our children. And so we are, again, confronting perhaps one of the gravest challenges to American democracy that we have ever faced. You can sort of see it in the anger and the disruption of these people who are so angry and frightened, maybe, and threatened. So these are difficult times. How can we navigate them? I urge us to consider lessons from Brown versus Board of Education, because for a time, it offered school children a chance to learn alongside their fellow students. Students who had different life experiences, different perspectives, different backgrounds. Some people saw that as a threat, and we know that in some places there was trouble, serious trouble, with threats and violence, not so unlike the video clip that I just played. But we also saw light. We saw when the humanity of ordinary people embraced a different America that we could do wonderful things together. And so tonight, I'm going to tell you stories about the people at the center of Brown versus Board of Education who had the vision and courage to fight for a fairer, more inclusive, and more just America. These stories are valuable because they remind us not only of where we have been, but also of the journey this country has yet to take, the roads it has yet to travel, the struggles it has yet to face. These are the stories about people who pursued the democratic ideals of equality, justice, and freedom. We need their stories in part because they are stories of determination and the will to make this country live up to its promise. So let's begin. Insert the slide. Thank you. So as many of you know, I'm sure many in this audience know, that Brown was actually 5 consolidated cases. There was Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, Briggs versus Elliott out of South Carolina, Davis v. County School Board of Prince Edward County, Virginia, Bowling versus Sharp out of the District of Columbia, and Gebhardt v. Belton in Delaware. It's easy to focus on the lawyers. They obviously played an important role, and I will discuss them in a bit. But I think it's most important to remember that there were people fighting courageously on the ground to secure better opportunities for their children. And they did so often without the protection of law. Insert slide of, thank you. I think, for example, of Joseph Albert Delane. As Richard Kluger writes in his extraordinary book, Simple Justice, Reverend Delane, as he was called, Reverend J.A. Delane, as he was called, had never been rebellious, though he was stern and forceful in the pulpit. But during World War II, as he watched young men in his community go off to war, something in him began to shift. He and others questioned, why are we fighting abroad with all the racial injustices that we face at home? And then one day in June 1947, he attended a meeting and heard another man of the cloth, Reverend James H. Hinton, preach that Black people could not rise until they got educated. And wasn't it powerfully clear that white people did not want them to get educated? This was time for legal action, Reverend Hinton said. And the place to start was with the buses. Everyone knew how hard it was for Black children to get to school without a bus. The areas where they lived flooded a lot. Sometimes the water was so high that they had to row a boat to school. Those who were in high school had to walk 9 miles just to get there. So most of them didn't bother. The NAACP was looking for someone to demand a bus. They knew that Black farmers had tried to buy their own bus to take their children to school, a secondhand bus they bought. But they needed gas, and the superintendent wouldn't pay for it. And the bus broke down a lot. So Reverend Delane, along with his friend Levi Pearson, enlisted the help of Harold Bulwer, who had been trained at Howard University, along with a cadre of other superstar lawyers. The case was filed on March 16, 1948, in the United States District Court. Pearson v. County Board of Education sought to ban the County of Clarendon from denying Black children a bus. White people in the county harassed Levi Pearson. Every white-owned store cut off his credit. White farmers refused to help him bring in his crop as they had in the past before he started making trouble. And finding fertilizer elsewhere was almost impossible. White people told him that if he would just forget about the buses, everything would be taken care of. But Mr. Pearson would not give up. By this time, Thurgood Marshall at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund was looking at the case. Marshall's record of success, will not surprise anyone here, had turned him into a legend. Marshall was interested, but to avoid the problems that Pearson had faced, he would need more plaintiffs. So Reverend J.A. Delane set out to find the plaintiffs. And he found plaintiffs, though it took 6 months. In the meantime, there would be more harassment, more reprisal. He was threatened by the KKK, and to protect him, his bishop ordered him to leave the county. All of this was taxing and hard. But Black people in Clarendon knew that it was the only way. They were tired of working the white man's fields. They needed schools. Without them, they said, there was no way out. And so for the first time, their hope was heavier than their fear. The people decided that instead of just seeking a school bus, they would seek to equalize everything in the schools. And so in May 1950, with the help of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the case of Briggs versus Elliott was filed. The court ordered the schools to be equalized, ignoring the larger question of the constitutionality of segregation. The Briggs case would become one of the 5 cases in the Brown litigation. Eventually, it would become a complete victory, but it was not without significant cost, personal cost, to Reverend Delane, whose home was burned to the ground. Other Black people lost their jobs and lost their sources of income and livelihood. In fact, the federal judge in the case was punished for siding with the plaintiffs and was forced to leave South Carolina by the state's House of Representatives. There is another story that we cannot forget about Linda Brown. Linda Brown of Topeka, Kansas, who through her father, Oliver Brown, was the lead plaintiff in the litigation. Topeka, Kansas was a Jim Crow town. There were no separate waiting rooms at the train and bus stations, and Black people did not have to ride in the back of the local buses, but in most other ways, it was segregated by law as well as by custom. Thus, opportunities were limited. There were 18 elementary schools for whites, but only 4 for Blacks. Other services were hard to come by. There were just a few restaurants that served Black customers. Only one movie theater would allow Black people in, but only if they sat in the balcony. And the other 5 theaters were only for whites. Employment prospects also were bleak. So Black people created their own businesses, beauty and barber shops, barbecue restaurants, and bars. Still, opportunities were hard to come by. One Black-owned drugstore folded. Black retailers had a hard time getting any credit. Black people in Topeka took it all in quietly until the Second World War. And then they started to lose their patience and ask questions. Why weren't Black children offered the same opportunities as white students? And so then they started to resist. I should point out here that Black teachers were wary of these conversations. No one could question the credentials, the skill, and the dedication of Black teachers. Indeed, at 2 of the 4 Black schools in town, more of the Black teachers held master's degrees than any of the teachers in the white grade schools. Mamie Luella Williams was a good example. She had taught 3 generations of some families in Topeka, including Oliver Brown, the father of Linda Brown. Linda Brown described Ms. Williams as a brilliant woman and a staunch, old-time teacher who really made you apply yourself. When Ms. Williams explained a subject, Linda Brown said, she stuck with her students until she was sure they understood it. So Black teachers were extraordinarily devoted to their students. They warned that integration would mean the end of all Black teaching jobs in Topeka. So Jim Crow might have had its drawbacks, but for teachers who thrived in Black enterprises, Jim Crow at the time was a safer bet. Eventually, however, the tide would turn. And in the 2 decades after the decision in Brown versus Board of Education, an estimated 38,000 teachers, Black teachers, would lose their job. Brown held the promise of opportunity, but there were serious costs. I want to pause here to introduce you to some of the lawyers who conceptualized and argued Brown. Charles Hamilton Houston, former dean of Howard Law School, a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Amherst College and Harvard, who graduated in the top of his class. Houston was a force of nature. He was known for saying that a lawyer is either a social engineer, do y'all know this, or a parasite on society. There was also William Hastie, who, like Houston, had attended Harvard Law School and was a Phi Beta graduate of Amherst College. Speaking of Amherst, I have it on good authority that the Education Studies Club at Amherst may be watching this lecture. If so, hello, Amherst. Perhaps the best known of the Brown team, again, is Thurgood Marshall. His full name was Thorogood, later shortened to Thurgood. Marshall grew up on Druid Hill Avenue in West Baltimore. Apparently, he was so mischievous in grade school that the principal would make him stay late after school to memorize a part of the United States Constitution each time he was caught breaking rules. And by the time he left school, Marshall knew the whole Constitution. Marshall would later head the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, known as the Inc. Fund in those times. Later, President Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, appointed Marshall to the post of Solicitor General, which, as I'm sure you all know, is the person who argues cases on behalf of the U.S. government in the United States Supreme Court. In 1967, President Johnson appointed him to the Supreme Court, as I'm sure everyone here knows, where he served as a justice for 24 years before retiring in 1991. And of course, there were others, including James Nabrett, who would later succeed Mordecai Johnson as president of Howard. There was Robert Carter, a graduate of Lincoln University and Howard Law School. He also received his master's in law from Columbia, but that won't compare to Howard. We're good on that. He argued 22 cases in the U.S. Supreme Court and won 21 of them. I clerked for him. I always wondered what the one was, but I was afraid to ask him. There was Constance Baker Motley, the only woman on the legal team. She was the first Black woman to argue a case before the U.S. Supreme Court and also the first to serve as a federal judge, graduating from Columbia Law School in 1946. She led cases that integrated the universities of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, among others. And she argued 10 cases in the Supreme Court, winning 9 of them. And she assisted in nearly 60 cases that reached the High Court. Jack Greenberg, a graduate of Columbia Law School, would later lead the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Oliver Hill from Richmond, Virginia, who filed a suit on behalf of students in Farmville and would later become part of the Brown cases. And Spotswood Robinson, who argued before the Supreme Court and initiated an early seminal case to fight desegregation on trains and buses. Spotswood Robinson also played a critical role challenging racially restrictive covenants that prevented Black people from buying homes, and he too served as Dean of Howard for 3 years before he became a federal court judge in the District of Columbia in Washington, D.C., and served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for 23 years. So that takes us to the case itself of Brown versus Board of Education. Brown, as I'm sure you all know, held that intentional racial segregation in public schools violates the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The case was the product of a litigation strategy that was conceptualized by Charles Hamilton Houston. As Richard Kluger writes in his landmark book, Simple Justice, how many of you, by show of hands, if I can see them, have read Simple Justice or know Simple Justice? Oh, that's a good number. It's it's an 800-page book. So yeah. A lot of information in that book. In 1922, the resources to pursue the litigation strategy came from a 21-year-old Harvard undergraduate by the name of Charles Garland, who had decided not to accept his share of an estate left by his father. The Garland Fund, as it was called, was administered by a group of lawyers, writers, politicians, and other activists. And this group decided that the Garland Fund would finance a large-scale, widespread campaign to promote the constitutional rights of Black people in the South and to promote political and civil equality. So the fund granted the NAACP $100,000 to carry out a legal campaign to challenge unequal funding in public schools throughout the South. At the recommendation of Charles Hamilton Houston, then Dean of Howard Law School, the NAACP would hire Nathan Ross Margold to assist with the legal strategy. Margold, however, was skeptical of the plan, which called for launching lawsuits in states across the South to force officials to provide equal facilities. The problem with the plan was that it would be like trying to empty a swimming pool with an eyedropper, given the thousands and thousands of school districts in the South. Another major problem was that this equalization drive would have to be carried out, not only district by district, but also year by year. It was not a viable approach. So Margold argued for a different path, one that would launch a frontal attack on the doctrine of separate but equal, which had been enshrined by the U.S. Supreme Court's 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson. What was Plessy about? In a nutshell, Plessy meant that as long as facilities were equal, states could constitutionally keep Black people and white people separate. Separate in the schools, separate buses, separate hospitals, separate parks, separate swimming pools, separate, literally telephone booths. I checked that. It was a doctrine of racial apartheid. And the consequences of that separation were hard to overstate. The facilities that were available to Black people were almost always inferior when it came to public education. The books were outdated. Schools and classrooms were falling apart. Teachers were underpaid. In fact, in the fall of 1934, Charles Hamilton Houston took a 4-week trip to the South to inspect its public schools. And what he saw was deeply disturbing. In one county, no students had registered for 7th grade because they were still out gathering crops. In another school, there were no toilets. Boys had to use the woods and were required to cross the railroad and the highway to get there. Another school provided nothing except teachers and 2 tons of coal per year. Black students had to supply the blackboards, erasers, crayons, stoves, fuel, and had to make most of the repairs on the building. One of the schools that Houston saw had 68 students packed into one room that was 20 by 16 feet with 7 benches. There were no tables, no desks, no stove, just one chair and an open fireplace. Another school had no drinking water on site. Children had to cross an abandoned highway to drink from a fountain at an abandoned gas station. Meanwhile, white schools had multiple classrooms, many teachers, assembly halls, pianos, individual desks, 3 buses for transportation. So the lawyers decided to change their strategy, which was to suffocate Plessy by challenging the unequal provision of education throughout the South. But they were very careful about their approach. Lawsuits challenging segregation in elementary and secondary education would be too sensitive, they thought, too controversial, because children were involved. So Houston concluded that the attack on segregation should begin in the graduate and professional schools, where students were older and more mature, and fears of racial mixing were less pronounced. And cue the slide. This is a slide of Heman Sweat, who was a graduate school student, and you can see he's isolated in the classroom, right? They still figured out a way to separate. Even if they were in the classroom, Black folks were in the classroom, they still figured out a way to segregate them in the classroom. But he was in the classroom. So by attacking segregation in graduate and professional schools where students were older and more mature, fears of racial mixing would be less pronounced. And if there was less fear, whites would be less likely to respond with anger and possible violence. And the facts made for good law. You all know good facts make good law. Because aside from Howard and Meharry Medical School in Nashville, there were no graduate or professional schools at any Black college in the South. So if a Black person wanted to become a lawyer, a doctor, an architect, an engineer, he or she would have to travel hundreds, possibly thousands of miles from home to secure a graduate education. This made for a cleaner strategy. It did not depend on demonstrating unequal levels of funding. And it had the benefit of not involving younger students in elementary and secondary schools, which would generate an uproar. And the remedy was also clear. The South would either have to build and operate separate graduate schools for Blacks or admit them to white schools. So the thinking was that by dealing with adults rather than children, it made a cleaner case also for the U.S. Supreme Court, which was obviously where all of this was headed. And if graduate schools could be desegregated, it could help build precedent for integrating undergraduate institutions and eventually secondary schools. So this strategy was very methodical. It was deliberately incremental. But in that time, it was the way to go because they couldn't afford to lose. Of course, that did not mean that racism would go away. It did not mean that there were no risks, indignities, or harms associated with this strategy. But these cases were largely successful, and they helped to build precedent for challenging segregation in public education. Eventually, the lawyers returned to elementary and secondary schools. That included Linda Brown, who was the lead plaintiff and the case's namesake, as you all know. It also included Oliver Brown. Mr. Brown was a dedicated father of 3 little girls. He was a welder who repaired boxcars and was also a part-time assistant pastor at St. John AME Church. They lived in a racially mixed neighborhood in Topeka, Kansas. Linda Brown attended the Monroe School about a mile away. And like the other plaintiffs, the road to her school was sometimes long, or was long, and sometimes treacherous. Her school was 15 blocks away. She had to leave home at 7:40 a.m. to get to school by 9 and traveled through dangerous switching yards to get there. One day, her father decided to try a different strategy and to try to enroll her in the white school, the Sumner School. But she was denied. And thus, Brown versus Board of Education was born. Insert slide. And there they are. Why does segregation matter? Over the years, it has become commonplace to talk about the failures of Brown and what it did not accomplish. Many argue that it did not accomplish full integration in public schools, and that integration, whenever it did happen, did not endure. And I want to suggest that this slide here is from the work of Elizabeth Anderson at the University of Michigan, and she writes that segregation of social groups is a principal cause of group inequality. It isolates disadvantaged groups from access to public and private resources, from sources of human and cultural capital, and from the social networks that govern access to jobs, business connections, and political influence. And it can reinforce stigmatizing stereotypes about the disadvantaged and thus cause discrimination. So many argue that Brown did not accomplish full integration in public schools, and that integration, as I said before, whenever it did happen, did not endure. And so 70 years after Brown, many schools are still intensely segregated by race and ethnicity, by class, and by language. So what can we say about Brown's significance and meaning? And how should we understand its significance today when public education is under assault? The insert slide, please. So I want to draw on a point that was made by the author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And she talks in her, it's a TED Talk, actually. Check it out if you haven't seen it. And she talks in her TED Talk about the danger of a single story. And the danger of a single story is that people will assume that Black people, brown people, people who are different in meaningful ways for society, right, can only move in one lane, are a certain way. People are a certain way. And the danger of a single story is that it doesn't allow for the breadth and complexity of people. It doesn't allow for the possibility that people from different backgrounds think and feel in different ways. And so, with that, how should we understand, again, the significance today of public education when it is under assault? During the Brown era, Brown produced a system where students from different backgrounds were able to assemble in classrooms. They learned to overcome the challenges of difference. And through Brown, we have learned many different kinds of lessons, not only the lessons of school integration when it was actually happening meaningfully, but also how to embrace diversity and difference. So people say that Brown doesn't matter, but I want to push back a little bit on this because I think Brown still holds valuable lessons. And I want to discuss a few of them in the time that I have left. Martha Minow, who is the former dean of Harvard Law School, writes that the strategy of law reform that led to Brown inspired people to become concerned about exclusion and inequality. There is no shortage of people who invoke Brown as an ideal or a benchmark, or dare I say, a lodestar for justice. I think it's fair to say that it had a hand in inspiring civil rights legislation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act, the Equal Educational Opportunities Act of 1974, which required schools to overcome language barriers that impeded equal participation in instructional programs. And it has created opportunities in the sphere of disability law. As Martha Minow notes, in 1967, Judge Skelly Wright applied Brown to find that the system of tracking in D.C. public schools and the resulting racial composition in those classrooms violated the U.S. Constitution. Gay, lesbian, transsexual students have also invoked Brown, and it has been invoked on behalf of religious students in religious schools by immigrants and people who don't have citizenship. They have also argued for inclusion in ways that echo Brown's commitment to equal opportunity and the importance of education. In other words, Brown versus Board of Education has helped make this country better, fairer, and more just. And finally, to return to where we began, I believe that Brown plays another role. As Elizabeth Anderson writes in her book, The Imperatives of Integration, integration helps students not to fear difference. Avoiding segregation can also improve access to opportunity for Black and Brown people. Perhaps most importantly, integration helps us not to become captive to the sentiments of racial caste. It reminds us that we often have more in common than we realize. In other words, integration helps bring us together. As I've mentioned, as I'm sure you all know, we are living in a time when American democracy and democratic values are under attack. So we have to ask ourselves, what do we do? What do we make of this? Brown holds lessons for us here too. And the lesson here, I think, is hard, but also very simple. Brown teaches us about the importance of proximity to each other and the power of association, having conversations with people you don't know, people you disagree with, and trying to understand them, and then hoping they will do the same. The late, great Lonnie Guinier, along with Gerald Torres, once wrote a book called The Miner's Canary. As some of you may know, miners used canaries to test the dangers for dangers in the mine. If the canary didn't survive, that signaled that entering the mine would be too dangerous. I want to suggest that segregation is our canary in the mine, because in many ways it's a signal of social harm. And I'm not talking about voluntary segregation. I'm talking about compelled, forced segregation. Segregation creates mistrust and misunderstanding. For a moment in time, Brown showed us a different way. And perhaps one day we can be there again. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Boddie, for your insightful and impactful lecture. Your deep understanding of the challenges facing our nation's public education system and our democracy at large not only serves as a wake-up call, but inspires action within our community of scholars, policymakers, and practitioners. So what we're going to do now, I'm going to invite Professor Boddie to join me in our living room, where we're going to have a little conversation, and then we'll welcome questions from you all. So start thinking of them. So thank you again for your insightful talk. And I know there are lots of questions that folks would like to ask, but I get to ask them first. So I guess I am struck by your comment that many people talk about Brown and think about Brown as a failure. And I guess I wanted to hear you talk a bit more about who and what failed Brown.
Well, eventually the Supreme Court failed Brown, that's for sure. Can you all hear me? Yeah. The courts failed Brown. And I sometimes feel that people today think that, and actually I don't, I know they think that integration is overrated. Like, why do we need integration, right? A lot of people that I've spoken with think that, that we don't necessarily, it's not necessarily useful or helpful. They don't see, I guess, what I see. It's hard for me to explain what they think because I don't agree with them, but I think that many people were concerned about what happened to Black teachers. I think that's a major concern that people had and probably still have, to the extent that we're trying to pursue integration in other realms.
So as we think about the current court and the rejection of race-conscious education policies across levels in terms of educational institutions, where does that leave those of us who wish to see the full potential of Brown realized in terms of strategy?
I can't tell you how much I have struggled with this question. I spent so many years working on affirmative action and higher education because for many of the reasons that I believe so deeply in Brown, I believe that affirmative action in higher education can bring students from different backgrounds together, provides key critical opportunities for students who are deserving and smart and talented and wouldn't otherwise have them. We have to find a way to create opportunity in this moment. And I think that there are ways, and I know that there are legal scholars who are working on ways to do that without violating the law. But we have to look for different ways maybe to frame policy in order to make sure that that schools, don't get into trouble with the United States Supreme Court, because universities are very wary and anxious about this. I think we also have to be creative, and we have to look for alternatives. And there are people who are doing that.
Yeah, I wonder if we can turn to that, because as you show on the slide so powerfully, Brown is the culmination of deep collaboration, right? Lawyers and educators and faith leaders. And I know that you did incredibly impactful work in New Jersey with the Inclusion Project. Could you say a bit about that?
Yeah, I like making good trouble. I always say when I actually, I have to credit Gary Orfield, and I also want to give a shout out to not only to Professor Orfield, but also to Janice Siegel-Hawley and other researchers who are kind of engaged in this project of trying to figure some pieces of this out. So Gary Orfield, who is based in California and has done yeoman's work throughout his career on issues of equity and segregation and education. And he released a report that identified the most segregated states in the country. And New Jersey was 7th on that list. And I thought to myself, New Jersey? Really? New Jersey? New Jersey has a really interesting history. And what I also learned at the time, after Dr. Orfield released his report, was that in the 1940s, I think it was 1947, there was one Black legislator in the New Jersey state legislature. And he inserted, just him, all by himself, had inserted a provision in the New Jersey Constitution that barred segregation in public schools. I think only the state of Hawaii has a provision of this kind, which is also interesting. And so we used that provision and argued, and and this was a labor of love, because I was able to work not only with lawyers, but also with students and, as you mentioned, faith leaders and people from around the state, got them organized and excited about suing the state of New Jersey. And so we did. And 7 years later, there are some settlement discussions. We'll see how that turns out. But there is a tremendous amount of awareness now about the problem of school segregation in New Jersey. And there are not only educators, but also activists and, again, faith leaders and teachers and just young people who are pushing for holistically integrated schools in the state. So that's, so that makes me very happy. Even though I'm in Michigan, it makes me very happy about what's going on.
So we're approaching a presidential election.
Yeah, I heard about that. Yeah.
So let's assume there's a outcome that results in an administration that supports the ideals of Brown. What kind of policy action would you hope to see? And how could educational researchers shape that?
It's an interesting question. So much of the work of education happens at the local level, of course, but there are, through the administration, through the use of the Justice Department, there are many avenues to push for holistic, high-quality integration. And
Can you say more about those avenues in the Department of Justice? Because I'm not sure everyone here knows about them.
Well, so the Department of Justice has had a docket of school desegregation. It does do work on school desegregation. The Department of Education, of course, is really the lead for handling cases around school integration. But I know that the Catherine Lehman, who leads that department, is very committed to those ideals. I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here. If I am, I'm sure I'll hear it. But I believe that there are people within the federal government who are very committed to this work, and will, and if the opportunity presents itself through a Harris administration, they'll make the most of it.
Great. Okay. Thank you. I wonder, should we invite questions now from you all? I'm supposed to be monitoring these microphones, but I can barely see because of the light. So come forward if you would like to ask a question. Okay, I do. There we are. Oh.
Hi, my name is Krista, and I was wondering if you could speak to school choice and whether or not you think there are legal provisions that would keep the options for school choice from being a new segregated system.
I think there are ways to design choice policies that would help to manage the problem of resurfacing school segregation. So yes, so for school choice, you just have to figure out a way to design it so that it didn't run afoul of, like, the Supreme Court's jurisprudence around considerations of race. But I think there's a way to do it and to avoid that problem. Probably can't say more than that.
I think I'll go to this side and then come back. Please.
Hello, my name is Angela Page, and I am a School of Education graduate from Howard University. I'm also a retired educator from Prince George's County Public School Systems. And I run my own STEM program. first question that I have of those schools that were observed in the South that lacked a lot of educational materials, has anyone tracked what those students were doing as they progressed in their education? Like, what type of careers did they end up with? Because in my experience as an African American educator, I have high expectations for all of my students. And I have something special for my African American students because I see the inequality, okay? And we have to have something that meets the needs of our students while we're fighting inequality, of the so-called minority students. But first, I want to know, is there any research that shows the progression of these students in the Southern schools that lacked a lot of educational materials, were in the large classes with one teacher, no books? Because I had to deal with that even in Prince George's County. But I'm creative, so I didn't have books, up-to-date books, but I started Xeroxing articles that related to my content, which made the content that we were going over up to date. And just my experience as an educator, African American teachers are very creative, okay? And we find ways to make things happen when we don't have the equipment.
Can I thank you so much for sharing, first of all, your experience and for the question. Can we have Professor Boddie respond to your question now?
Yes.
All right, thank you.
I know that there is research around education for Black. There is research around education for Black children who came of age in the era of Brown. I don't know that that answers your question. I think what that research shows is that students in that era who were able to avail themselves of opportunities after Brown, in some ways tended to be more successful, but I think the issues of equity in the classroom in some ways became a barrier because, right, the forces of racism resurface. And so Black children in many ways were sometimes denied education, even in integrated classrooms. But I think on balance, the research shows that Black children did do better after Brown because of the resources that were available to them, if that makes sense.
Okay, I'm going to move to this side of the room where folks are waiting. Thank you again for your question.
Good evening. My name is Greg White. Shout out to Michigan. I'm a Wolverine myself, graduated from the Ed School and from Hugsy's Ed School as well, former educator. My question was this, given that most of our young people are children of color, one, are we looking to measure segregation differently in our schools? And two, do we notice any legal or cultural indicators that hint towards us moving towards equity and lower levels of segregation?
So, and actually, I'm gonna circle some of that back to you because I know you do research in this area. But so I think one of the problems that has surfaced, and I'm sure this will not come as a as a surprise to many of the people in this audience, is that the forces of inequality do show themselves again and again. And one of the very serious problems that I think we have are issues of, first of all, how Black children are treated and disciplined in the classroom, and also issues of tracking. And so those issues, I think, in many ways have sort of destabilized the progress that we made after Brown. I know that there is, in some areas, there is heightened awareness of it, but not sufficient to address the problem.
Yeah, I think the question is a really important one as we think about our nation's demographics, especially in public education, where 80% of school-age children attend, that many students in our public education system are students of color or minoritized students. And so I think the way that we're starting to think about it in terms of research are the levels of segregation in comparison to that diversity. And so you still have Black and Latinx students hyper isolated from students of other racial and ethnic backgrounds and linguistic backgrounds. And that, I think, is a big focus. So.
Hello, my name is Terrell Morton. I am an assistant professor of identity and justice and STEM education at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I am also a proud alumnus of the illustrious North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, Aggie Pride. So thank you, AERA, for hosting this lecture on a historically Black college and university. Professor Boddie, I wanted to ask, in your lecture, you talked about the importance of social science research in supporting the outcomes of Brown. And as educational researchers, we know the importance and value our research brings, while we also know that we don't always have control over how people will use our work. For instance, those of us that are critical of the current educational system do so as a way to elevate and enhance it, yet and still we find that those who are interested in its demise also use our work to support their claims. And so as someone who is committed to public education, what advice would you give to educational scholars interested in enhancing public education, recognizing that it is continuing to disserve Black and brown bodies, while also being mindful of the fact that our work continues to get co-opted and used against us?
I'm trying to think of an answer. What comes to mind is a cease and desist order, but that's probably not what you're thinking of. That is obviously very, very deeply troubling. And I don't, I guess one thing I would think that comes to mind is, and this may not be really sufficient or adequate, but calling folks out publicly. I don't know, on social media, right? I mean, we have like vehicles available to us for disseminating, right? Critiques of the people who are co-opting this scholarship. And I don't know, it also kind of feels to me like there's some ethical issues around that. And so maybe it should be called out through that lens as well. But yeah, that's all I got at the moment. Thank you for your question, because I learned something. Thank you.
I feel like you have an answer from your talk. And if we look at your historical story, the stories you're offering us of the lawyers working with the researchers to ensure that the research was used in a way that would be in service of broadening equality of opportunity. And I wonder if there's an answer there from history.
You try to like tell me that I need to like flex a little bit more or something. I don't know. I get you. I hope I could deliver. So it could be an intellectual property question, I guess, is maybe one way to think about it. I I don't know about fighting it in court because I think you would run into, problems possibly with kind of freedom of expression and all that kind of stuff. But I would call them out publicly, and I would do it on social media. I think that actually might be the most effective way than like litigation. But
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Please.
Hello, my name is Kaylee Moore. I am currently a junior political science major, psychology and human development double minor, attending Howard University, but I'm from Chattanooga, Tennessee. And my question is, coming from a low socioeconomic school where I had to lead a protest for our deplorable building conditions, which is currently getting built right now, I realized that our parents and other people of color didn't know how to combat our situation where like you should start at the school boards. But when I went, I seen that a lot of white parents and organizations were advocating for book bannings and the end of teaching slavery. So how do we push the importance of going to the school boards and advocating for what we want as adults that don't know anything about it?
I suspect you already know the answer to that question just because of the way you asked it. But it's such a powerful observation because school boards hold so much power. And having attended some school boards where, like you, we look around, there's nobody else there, and so I think part of it is a question of helping to reach out to folks and explaining to them why this matters and the level of power that these boards have over the curricula and over all kinds of school policies. I think it's just a matter of engaging with them and maybe bringing them along to some of your meetings. I think that's probably the best way to deal with it.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thanks, AERA, Howard, Janelle, Felice, especially Dr. Boddie. My name is Dr. Ruhollah Agasaleh. I'm a survivor of war in my country and a survivor of law enforcement and school policy violence in this country. Thank you for highlighting and reminding us of these systems of apartheid. While we are here to celebrate school desegregation, thousands of students, teachers, and scholars are dying in Gaza. All 12 institutions of higher education in Gaza have been bombarded, and 90,000 of college students have been impaired from going to school, not to mention the number of K-12 schools. It's important to know that all of us are paying for this genocide and funding a regime of apartheid in Palestine. Thousands of students in this country have spoken up and were violently silenced, detained, arrested, and threatened. However, this body, AERA, has been refusing to condemn the genocide, call for a ceasefire and divestment. What you quoted from Hamilton, lawyers are social engineers or parasites in the society, which is not untrue about educators. I wonder what our children will think about us, social engineers or parasites.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. What's happening in Gaza is deeply troubling. In one of my classes a few weeks ago, some of the students were expressing their frustration and outrage about the lack of attentiveness and awareness and vocalness around the issues that are happening in Gaza. And the University of Michigan has in many ways tried to suppress that speech. And so I think the way to address it is to do just as you were doing, not sure where I don't see you. Oh, there you are. And to continue to press and persist. And in my own ways, I'm trying to deal with this at the institution where I am. But I think what you're pointing out is that there is a reluctance and a fear in ways that I can't fully understand about engaging. And so thank you for raising what you did.
Thank you, Dr. Boddie, for your wonderful lecture today. My name is Gaurav Harshe, he, him, his pronouns. I'm from Mumbai. I'm a third-year PhD student at University of South Carolina. And thank you so much for elevating Reverend Delane's story. We have their poster plastered in our Museum of Education. So it was a really nice, refreshing surprise here. My question was, how, if at all, can students like myself from countries and cultures around the world engage with the US ideals of democracy while studying here in a way that promotes exercising lessons from Brown?
I'm sorry, can you say the last part again?
Yes. How, if at all, can students like myself from countries and cultures around the world engage with US ideals of democracy while studying here in a way that promotes exercising lessons that we've learned from Brown?
I guess I'm wondering whether we have something to learn from you. I mean, I'm always interested in how what countries around the world think about American democracy, and whether we're living up to the ideals that we claim to live up to. And so I don't know. I don't necessarily feel qualified to give advice on that score. But I mean, what I'd be interested in personally is hearing about the ways that educational democracy is practiced in your country and in other countries around the world, because I feel like we might have some things to learn from you. Beyond that, I don't have much to offer.
Hi, my name is Alexa Rodriguez. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Virginia. As you know, there's a real possibility that the legal precedent of Brown can be rolled back, depending on the outcome of this next election. And so I'm really concerned on, what the potential next steps might be. So with your legal experience, what are people talking about? Like, what are the next steps that people are prepared, especially legal scholars? How are they prepared for that possibility?
I think the problem is that in many ways, Brown has already been rolled back and was rolled back many times in cases like Milliken versus Bradley, which came out of Detroit, where educators there tried to expand the support for Brown and were slapped down by the U.S. Supreme Court. That was like in the early 1970s. Later, there was a case called Dowell versus Oklahoma, where the court also effectively rolled back aspects of Brown versus Board of Education. And so the challenge is that in many ways, like Brown, if it's honored in the breach. That doesn't mean that we should give up, because I think that we can support Brown and re-envision Brown in other ways, right? So for the people who've talked about, teaching it in schools, talking about its importance, talking about why it matters, so I think that's a way of holding on to the ideals of Brown. We won't be able to change the law until we get another Supreme Court.
Good evening. Hi, Dr. Boddie. My name is Amaya DaCosta, and I'm a freshman architecture student at this university from New York. My question was, do you think because of how deeply tied segregation is in our history, humans naturally segregate themselves for their own safety and comfort? And to top that off, what are your suggestions for encouraging minority groups to step out of this barrier of their comfort zone?
I couldn't hear. It was a little bit of
It
feedback.
was a little hard to hear. There was some feedback. Yes.
Sorry. Okay.
It's not you. It's
My question was, do you think because of how deeply tied segregation is in our history, humans naturally segregate themselves for their own safety and comfort currently today? And to top that off, what are your suggestions for encouraging minority groups to step out of this barrier of their comfort zone?
I think that students, Black and brown students in particular, isolate themselves because, I think many of them feel disrespected in the classroom. And I think that they, for that reason, they're looking for ways to protect themselves. And so personally, I think it's incumbent upon administrators and teachers and, principals to create ways for students to feel more comfortable in the classrooms. I don't know that should be on the students. But I appreciate your question because I hear the spirit of it, right? Is that you're looking for students to engage and to sort of push themselves out of that comfort zone. And I think it's a wonderful thing if it can happen, but I would worry about putting the onus on the students. I think it should be on the teachers to create spaces of comfort in the classroom.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Isabel, and I'm a PhD student in anthropology at Stanford. And my question actually dovetails with the previous one. I wanted to ask about the space that you held in your talk for forms of voluntary separation and what you sort of had in mind, whether it's HBCUs or something like affinity groups within schools, and also whether you see in any, whatever you envision, some potential for the recovery of the collateral losses that occurred with the end of segregation in terms of the jobs of Black educators that you mentioned.
As to the last question, I don't know for sure. My sense is that those numbers that we've not made that up is my understanding, but others who are more familiar with that area of the research might know better. And sorry, the other part of your question was, can you just reframe it or
I was just wondering what you had in mind when you held open the space for forms of voluntary separation and distinguished that from segregation. What were you sort of envisioning there?
Well, segregation, I think, is compelled. Like the definition of segregation implies that it's compelled and that it's not a matter of choice. I wouldn't describe. So when students talk about, sorry, there's a little bit of feedback. When students talk about, wanting to create safe spaces in schools and classrooms, and it sort of goes to the question that was asked a moment ago. I don't want to blame, and I don't want to say the victim, but I don't want to blame people who feel like they're not being cared for in the classroom. I think, again, that's a matter for the school administration and for teachers. I think one thing we can do is to help students figure out, if they want to, how to approach administrators and teachers to share with them that they don't feel comfortable or they feel isolated in the classroom. And again, the onus is on the schools and the teachers, the administration, to figure out how to make that happen.
Yes, please. Hello. Can you hear me all right? Hi, so my name is Fahima Babosa. I'm a senior psychology major, human development minor from Boston, Massachusetts, by way of Uganda. And my question for you today is, how can I, as a young Black person going into the world of psychology and education, reinforce the uplifting of Black youth that you've discussed here today, and especially through the lens of a new generation going into the workforce who might not be as aware of those who had preceded us and their knowledge of the education sphere and academia, going into that world and making sure that, Black youth are being uplifted and heard. I know it's a little similar to a previous question asked by one of my peers, but also just through the lens of psychology, since I will be working with, ideally, kids in elementary and middle schools.
I'm sorry. Can you speak a little bit more into the mic? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the full.
So again, my question is, how can I, as a young Black person going into the world of psychology and education, reinforce the uplifting of Black youth that you've discussed here today, especially through the lens of a new generation going into the workforce who might not be aware of those who have preceded us in their knowledge of academia and just navigating educational spaces and making sure that we're uplifting, again, young Black youth going into educational spaces?
I think it's, it sounds like you already probably know the answer to that question because you asked the question, but I think it's a matter of supporting young people and talking to them about how to make a way in the fields of education or the fields that they're interested in pursuing, and supporting them and, providing advice. And when, sometimes they need course correction, sometimes they need you to reach out to people who can provide them a job. So I think there are lots of different ways to support young people. The most important thing, I think, is to also show them that you care, that you're trying to make sure that they have the opportunities that they're seeking. I found that that students know I shouldn't say they know. Students appreciate it when people who have resources and power reach out to them and support them and help them navigate the choices that they're trying to make in their lives. And so I think just showing them that you're willing to do that is also critically important and valuable.
Thank you.
So thank you for all the questions. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more. I know that there are lots of people queued up, but there will be a reception after, and I hope you'll approach Professor Boddie and ask your question then.
Hi, I'll try to make this very, that's loud. I'll try to make this very quickly. My name is Caleb Jaden Brantley. I'm a senior political science major, criminology minor here at Howard University. I'm on the pre-law and pre-divinity track. I think about my siblings and myself and a lot of students here who are growing up at an age where there are attacks on democratic institutions, particularly related to education and what students can learn and have access to, especially as the education, the curriculum is a reflection of who they are, who they should be. Being someone who wants to be an attorney one day, but even now, just as a student and a lot of students across America and around the world, what can I do now, or what's your charge to students and just young people? What can we do now to support the right to a quality education for all students and for all people, where curriculum and diversity can be in conversation with one another?
So I think it's a matter of, I hope this is responsive to your question. I think that the sort of the basic lesson is to support students where they are and to share your insights and knowledge and advice that you might. Well, actually, was the question about advice you would offer, or advice that I'm worried now that I missed your question.
Advice that you would offer, yes.
Oh, yes, okay. So I would, for students who are interested in being attorneys, is that part of the,
Well, yeah, just more broadly, like what, like young people, what can we do to help in the fight for quality education?
there's a lot that can be done. I mean, so there's actually a good group in New York City called Integrate NYC, where high school students are actually out demanding quality opportunities for education, and also looking for ways to promote integration that may or may not be part of the charge that you're talking about. But again, going back to some of the questions that were asked earlier, I think a lot of this is having conversations with young people, showing them that you care about their well-being, offering them advice, being available when they need help, when they feel down, when they feel like they're not reaching the goals that they would like to reach, and to sort of being part of a support system. And for those who want to become attorneys, you can have them reach out to me. And we can talk after. I can give you my contact information. But I think a lot of this, again, is just showing that you care and being supportive where you can.
Thank you for all the questions.
Yeah, thank you for all the questions. This is always a collaborative process, with an extraordinary talk that kicked this off, a conversation with Janelle and Elise that really riveted you to ask the questions that you've asked. We will conclude and move to the reception in Blackburn Hall, is that right? Yes, Center, which is around the corner. But I mainly wanted to say to everyone that we do this every year, and whether with our legal scholar's hat or our social science scientist hat, we continue to collectively move forward. It doesn't mean that the larger society in which we sit, or the societies and contexts in which we sit, don't require continuing struggles, reconceptualizations, asking new questions in new ways. But the fact that evidence and data and research and legal arguments do not always prevail does not mean that we can continue to press forward and to better understand how we can work together, as Elise emphasized, as Brown typified. So go with that positive message of what we can do together, because we will, and we'll be at a very different place in 3 years, 5 years from now. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Elise.